Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming today. So my name is Arno Pedram. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the former Queer Club president. I'm a journalist and a graduate from the school, and I helped organize this panel. I wanted to quickly introduce the panel by talking about something that I think everyone should keep in mind as they listen and exchange with our amazing panelists. So for a lot of you here today, this topic might be new or relate to something outside of your communities, but it's not the case for everyone. 3 weeks ago, one of my dear friends, Sasha Dior, died by suicide in Toronto, Canada. Sasha was a proud trans Somali woman. She was one of the most generous people I ever met. She was loving, she was kind, she was beautiful. At her funeral, many told stories about the ways she opened so many doors for other trans women to be who they wanted to be and do whatever the fuck they wanted. But the world was unfair to her, and it got the best of her. Racism, transphobia, sexism, transmisogynoir, all these systems are attacking the communities we're going to be talking about today. But I want you to know that these people are not just statistics or sad stories. They're friends, they're chosen families, they're loved ones. They're valued members of communities, they're mentors, they're workers, they're magicians, they're also healers. And the void that they leave behind needs to be reckoned with. Tiana Davarea Alexander in Chicago, Samuel Edmund Damian Valentin in Puerto Rico, Bianca Muffin Banks in Atlanta, Dominic Jackson in Mississippi, 50 Bands in Louisiana, Alexis Kimmy Icon Braxton in Florida. These are the names of the trans people of color, all but one of them Black trans women who were murdered this year in the US. For them and for Sasha, I ask that we give them a minute of silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Arno. And good evening to everyone. Thank you again for attending our event. This is the first collaboration with all three of the major clubs at the J School. So we're super excited to get to do this. And it has been a long time coming. The planning team has been working on this for months. And so we're super excited to finally have it. This is a collaboration between the National Association of Black Journalists, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and Queer Club, all at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And tonight we will be covering Tony McDade and trans lives of color. Additionally, as Arno indicated, we will be discussing serious matters that may be sensitive and triggering. So remember to take care of yourselves. And if you need a break, please feel free to take it. And for the audience members, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box. Please send them in there. We will be saving some time toward the end to answer any of your questions once we answer the prepared ones that the planning team has come up with. My name is Noel Lilly. I'm the former president of the Association of Black Journalists at the Newmark J School. I'm also a member of the class of 2020 and a reporter at News 12 in the Bronx and Brooklyn. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you, Noel. Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandra Pedraza. My pronouns are they, them. I am a freelance journalist and a current student at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism. I'm located in Jackson Heights, Queens, here in New York. I'm an active member of the Queer Club of the Trans Journalists Association, and I'm also the current treasurer of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists at the school's chapter. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, and I'm also from Queens. My name is Amber Castillo. I'm the former president of our school's chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you, guys. So to our panelists, starting with Raquel and then Ishalaa and then Malcolm, if you could each take a minute to introduce yourselves and then we'll dive right into the questions.
Whole minute, wow. No, I'm just kidding, I won't take a minute. Hi everyone, I am so excited to be with you all tonight to talk about, these issues that are so dear to all of our communities on this call and especially on this panel, to also share this panel with some amazing experts and so much love for y'all's work. So yeah, my name is Raquel Willis, pronouns she and her. I am a writer, an activist, journalism. So I think maybe 7 years ago, I was in some of y'all's shoes, just like trying to navigate my last year of college. And I know it's probably very different for folks right now. But yeah, I understand what it's like to particularly be a person on many margins in J school. So sending y'all love and light, and I hope we can share some powerful stuff tonight.
Hello everyone, my name is Ishala Ortega. I'm Mexican from Tijuana. I'm an asylum refugee, and I am currently finishing my career in Hunter College as or majoring in Spanish, literature, and political science. I am currently working in a community health center as a care coordinator for people living with chronic conditions. And I am also an activist and an entertainer. I am celebrating 20 years of entertainer career, and I'm releasing my first ever song this day, specifically today. Yes, thank you. And I hope at the end, you all can get the song. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to participate in this. I think it's very important that everybody is aware of what is going on with the trans community specifically, and how important it is that people who talks about what happens to us, but they are not part of our community, know exactly how to translate from our experience to their sentiments, and of course, journalist reports, and why not? Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Malcolm. My pronouns are they and them. I am an educator, first and foremost, and an activist, and I have been an organizer as well. I should be clear, and I hope this doesn't feel performative, that I'm checking into you today from Lenape ancestral lands in Brooklyn, New York. I'm really hoping that that will continue to come up throughout our discussion today. The fact that even though we are, we're in this place called New York, that there's a much longer history and a relationship that's part of a colonial relationship that's so necessary to name, that New York only exists because of this colonial relationship with the Lenape peoples. The genocidal practices against their lands, against them, against their culture ways, and sort of their resilience and organizing against like a society and a world that found their existence to be inconvenient, right? And so I'm sitting here really inspired to be on this panel with all these brilliant folks. I'm really excited for what's going to go down and what we're going to talk about. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you so much to each of you. And Malcolm, that is very, very well said. We appreciate that, and something important to keep in mind tonight and every day. So we are going to open up our questions, and we're going to start off addressing some specific cases, and then we'll move on to some broader conceptual questions. So the first thing we want to do is give a little bit of background additionally. So the title of our panel, part of it is covering Tony McDade. For those in the attendee group who don't know, Tony McDade was a trans man killed by police last summer on May 27th Body camera footage showed that he was pointing a gun at police before he was shot. And the year before, Layleen Polanco was an Afro-Latinx trans woman who died in Rikers Island while in solitary confinement. After both of these deaths, this was something that we saw a big effort pushed for better discussion around trans Black folks killed by police, particularly last summer when we saw the resurgence of civil unrest across the country. And we really want to discuss the connection between this community and what we're seeing with regards to police killings in addition to the criminal justice system. So our first question, and I will start with Raquel, what role do you think that the media plays in these events we mentioned with Tony McDade and Layleen Polanco? And why do you think that these two stories got more media attention than others we've seen in the past?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the main things we always have to address when we're talking about any community on the margins is that oftentimes the media is the first site where folks who may not be within that community interact with our stories and our experiences. And so as a trans person, I mean, it has continuously been true that most Americans say that they don't know personally or work personally with a trans person. And so that means that the stories, the narratives, the voices, the experiences that they encounter in media are so crucial to breaking down the systemic and colonial, to speak to what you were already saying, Malcolm, erasure of gender expansiveness. So yeah, so it's very important, it's very crucial. When I think about how we're even framing this, I don't know that I necessarily think that there has been a huge or a major transformative effort to talk about or elevate Black trans issues, and particularly interactions with the state and state violence. And similarly, talking about the trans person of color experience writ large, I don't think that there has been a major shift. You know, when the world kind of turned over after the murder of George Floyd, I know, you know, typically we're told to say police killing, but I will say with my activist and organizer and my Black person hat on, the murder of George Floyd, we saw this kind of outpouring of empathy and emotion and a desire to kind of change. But even with that case, it ignored that this has been ongoing, that George Floyd wasn't the first person to have their light, the first Black person to have their light snuffed out by police in the state, right? So even that kind of fantastical idea each time a case happens that may have a unique spin on it or have more eyes on it than ever before, we do a disservice to all of the folks that we have lost before that to act as if that is the only case that has happened. And I think because of that phenomenon, there was an eclipsing of what happened to Tony McDade just 2 days later. The other piece, and you shared this fact, Noel, that it was reported and revealed that Tony was holding a gun while he was having this encounter with the police. And so I think we also have to be very clear and transparent that when we look at victimhood in the society and who is seen as being worthy, which is kind of a weird way to say it, of empathy, of care, and of love, and of support, and of mourning, oftentimes it's already not Black people, it's already not trans people, it's already not queer people, anyone who's an other, even thinking of women writ large. But then to think, oh, and you can't say that this person was unarmed, I think that also played a role in how we discussed what happened to Tony McDade. Even I was like, oh Lord, this kind of complicates it a lot, and how do we talk about this? But if we can acknowledge in all of these other cases that we discussed, that overwhelmingly the state targets people who are on the margins and is often out of pocket when it comes to this idea of justice. We have to acknowledge that, yes, you could very well and most likely still be a worthy victim, whatever that even means, right? Because I don't know that it's our place to judge people's worthiness of being a victim if you're not even in the situation. You're still worthy of that distinction and worthy of that care and how we talk about what happened to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Ishalaa, what about you? What do you think, piggybacking off of Raquel said, what do you think about these particular cases? Do you agree that this is something that we really didn't see that much attention on? We saw a little bit of reporting about Tony McDade, but we kind of moved on so quickly, and we see that in the news cycle all the time, unfortunately. I'm curious, what do you think about these incidents and the media coverage and what role it played?
Yeah, I want to address something that for me is extremely relevant. It is that everything in this society is ruled by institutions. Media, or journalism, all of that is also an institution. And as any institution, it is contaminated with misogynism, with racism, and with patriarchy. So this sphere of hate that exists everywhere, in which at the top is a white millionaire man, and in the very bottom, you always will find a Black, poor, transgender woman. And those little stairs exist within our own community as well. If we are in a family, who's the most important? The man or the woman? And who's the less important? The man or the gay or the trans or whatever. It doesn't matter the color. It is about gender, it's about sex, it's about all of that institutionalized, internalized racism, misogyny, patriarchy that we all are living with. Even in our own community, if we are in a trans community by itself, who is more valuable there? I can assure you that if people from the trans community go and apply for a job, the first one who will get a job will be the trans male white. And it's gonna happen everywhere, in every part of the society. What media is doing right now, it is doing with every community in which we first look into what the person who has been killed did wrong before who the killer is and why it's so wrong to kill somebody, regardless of their behavior or their mental illness, or if they are like using substances. Regardless of all of that, there is a crime and it has to be persecuted as such. Yeah. And I think the media, it is important for the media in any stage or any kind to actually look into that and report towards the criminal, not the victim. That's for me extremely important. We can throw out there thousands of names of people who has been killed by police or by racism or by misogynists or whatever, who is part of the trans community. Thousands of people out there, but all of them has been described as sex workers, substance users. Why is this person doing at 3 o'clock in the morning? That he was, she or he was looking for to be killed. He was in trouble. That's what's being reported, and I think the media has to change that narrative in order for us or for the mainstream people to understand that nobody has to be a target of police brutality or the racism, trans misogynism that many people live with.
Thank you so much, both of you, for answering that. Ale, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. And to Ishalaa's point, just to add to that, it's absolutely true that it starts with the systems that are already in place that enforce, and the media is part of that system that enforce all of these patterns. But yeah, so the second thing that we wanted to talk about was about the walk-in wall trans ban. For those who don't know, earlier this month, there was a repeal for the walk-in wall trans ban. What that is that it was a law meant to discourage street sex work, but because the language around the law was so vague, it led to outdated profiling tactics, and activists in the trans community often refer to the ban as the stop and frisk for trans women. So we wanted to ask our panelists, for those who are familiar with the ban, the role the media played on the appeal, and what worked that you noticed and what didn't work. And yeah, I mean, Malcolm, why don't we start with you?
What role did the media play? I would say that the role that the media played was mostly to undermine the process and to make sure, right, that actually it would be very, very difficult for there to be context about what was actually happening on the street during those moments, right? I think that the most news sources and most media in the United States are consistently excusing police behaviors and also have been guilty of constructing the actual figure, the stereotypical figure that we see again and again of the trans street sex worker that everybody supposedly thinks is so ubiquitous, that is actually causing police officers to then look at trans people around him and see criminals and people breaking the law, et cetera, right? And so I think that's the main role that we're actually looking at. I'm sorry, I need to go on mute 1 second. I have my sibling is here, so I need to talk to him. Sorry about that.
You're absolutely fine. Yeah, I mean, just to add to Malcolm's point, there is this narrative that keeps coming up that is just anyone who is just, and it's to the point of the walking wall trans ban, if the profiling and the narrative that we attach to these bodies and the people, right? But yeah, but I don't know if Ishalaa or Raquel, you have something to add to that. And if there's something that you saw in the reporting for the walk and wall trans ban or any of the coverage that was happening that caught your eye, that you were this is working, this is good reporting, or the opposite, that was completely dismissed what the actual movement was about for the repeal.
I think there is two main things that the media reporting or coverage miss. First of all, is that walking while trans was to target prostitution, sex work, basically. But the media was not covering that trans people, and especially trans women, choose to be sex workers because there is no other options for us to do money. I consider myself a professional. I try to dress in a way to blend into the society. And even though I do that, I was stopped several times in the train stations because I am a trans person. And it is very difficult that the media only cover the political sides of it, but not the reasons behind of it, in which people are needed to throw themselves to the streets to make some money to cover their expenses because there is no job opportunities. We need to address that it's not being more than a decade in which transgender people can go to school being who they are. And you're not gonna make in 10 years, everybody a professional with a career. It's not happening yet with women who has 160 something years that they are allowed to go to school. It doesn't happen with Black people who has not even have a century to go to school and became something out of a career. How it is gonna happen with trans women that only have a decade or less than that to go to school? It took me almost more than 3 decades to go to school and finish a career. If I don't do that, I will be part of the sex work people. And it is important that the media actually target that situation, which is a long history of the situations that trans people are facing every single day. And it is not being covered. you just want, like media just wanna do like, oh, this person is under stress because he's being stopped by the police while trans. But it's not being covered. Like the reason why this type of laws exist is because we criminalize and demonize sex work, but we are not giving people the chance to actually not do sex work. And if they wanna do sex work, doesn't matter. There is always customers for that market. Why we are not covering the people who actually buy that market? Why only the people who perform sex work? So there is a lot to cover there. And I think media should do better and not just demonize and criminalize people who choose to do sex work. That is a lot of like complicated discussion about sex work, because there is people who actually do not have another option. And there is people also who choose to do sex work. And that is two different topics. We cannot just address the people who are forced to do sex work instead of the people who actually choose it, even if they have other opportunities. So that is another sensitive topic that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely, Ishala. And it ties, you know, weirdly, so it ties to like what Raquel was mentioning earlier, some way or another, about the victimhood, right? It's like, what do we consider a victim? Who is a victim? And is that the only person that is worth covering, right? It's the same thing. It's a person who chooses to do sex work, or it's a person who just happened to do it because of out of need. It doesn't matter, right? That's besides the point. And that's maybe where the media is falling to, you know, do the reporting, the in-depth reporting that we need. But yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's so much nuance that is erased from the discussion about sex work. And Ishalaa, you said that so perfectly, so beautifully. Like there's so much that we have not unpacked. And I think one of the things that I was never satisfied with in journalism school, and the things that I learned was kind of the lack of emphasis on the responsibility of being a journalist and being a reporter, and figuring out what your goals are, because everyone has a goal. You know, I think when we talk about objectivity, right, and this idea of being unbiased or whatever, in general, it's very much BS, right? I think there has always been a set of values or a set of goals behind reporting, behind the stories that we choose to tell, the folks that we choose to prop up as experts, and ones that we don't, the folks that we ask to be interviewed or not. Like there's some kind of bias probably in there, and you're like, okay, well, this person is probably going to give me what I want. And so what is your goal? I think for me, coming into journalism, I had to learn that part of my goal was to insert my values around social justice, around feminism, around pro-Blackness and pro-transness and pro-queerness and all of these different things. And I don't think that makes me less of a writer or journalist, because the stakes are so high. And if I bought into this very white, cisgender, straight, privileged idea of objectivity, I would be doing a disservice not only to my community, but to myself. So I totally am in line with that. I think in speaking about the Walking While Trans ban and some of the shortcomings of the reporting on it, you know, I did see some coverage over the years, right? Because this has been going on for a long time. And the last decade has really seen a ramp up of paying attention to these issues with the trans visibility moment and the tipping point, for better or worse. But we ignore that the criminalization of trans people and gender expansive and gender non-conforming people has been going on long before this moment, before this decade, before the last few decades. You know, some of the earliest records that we have as trans historical documents are ones uncovered from criminal records. You know, when I think about the stories of people like Mary Jones, who was a Black trans sex worker in the 1830s, who was put on trial in New York, right? I think about the fact that we only have that story because she was caught up in a media frenzy that came out of her being criminalized. And not only criminalized, right, but being kind of gawked at or looked at as like a spectacle because of who she was. And people weren't looking at her humanity. They called her the man monster because they did not even see her as not just a woman, but as a human. And so we can look at that as one of the earliest historical documents of a Black trans person in the United States to now. There is a whole legacy there, no matter how many years or centuries are in between that. So we have to acknowledge that the institution of journalism also, like you were saying, Ishalaa, has been so steeped in transphobia even before we had the term transphobia. So we got to let that sink in. And then the last thing I'll say, because I know I'm going a little long, but when I think about the Walking While Trans ban, it kind of suffers the same fate as a lot of anti-trans legislation, in that we look at these as such disparate things, like they're so disconnected from each other. And the Walking While Trans ban is so tied to the fact that more than, close to half of US states have already filed some type of anti-trans legislation this year. So it's not just the Walking While Trans ban. I mean, there are sex workers in Atlanta who are being profiled, but then we also are dealing with anti-trans legislation attacking trans youth who can't go to school and be their truest selves, or are in fear of it, or who can't participate in sports because they're in fear of having all of the things that they've worked for stripped away. So all of these things are tied together. And I think one of the biggest failures when we talk about any anti-trans legislation is that there's such a network of bigotry out there that we just can't isolate these and think that we're doing a good job in reporting.
Thank you all for that. I think, Raquel, what you mentioned about J School and this notion of objectivity being only from a white, straight, privileged man perspective, I think definitely resonates with a lot of the students attending this event as well. And pivoting a little bit, Malcolm, I wanted to ask you and open it up to the others as well. What do you think, because you all have touched on this idea that these are not isolated incidents and the media often reports on them as if they are. So how do you think the media and journalists need to ethically cover this epidemic and convey that these are not isolated one-off incidents? And how is that something that journalists can convey and cover as an epidemic that we see going on against trans people, specifically trans people of color, trans Black people?
You said what? I think the answer is to put cameras and microphones and pens and careers in the hands of trans people of color. I think that would be the most accurate way to do it. I think there's no way to convey the difference between reporting on the death of someone that you think is an inconvenience or that your institution sees as an inconvenience in society and reporting on the death of your sister. There's no way to name. And I think the clearest way we can see that actually is in the change in coverage that happened at Out.com when Raquel took the helm up, right? That was like the shift was clear, And so I really want to shout you out for that work, right? Because that it just revealed the exact kind of exclusions that have shaped the lack of empathy that there is for our people. Just at every level, people straight up just laugh. People straight up just, especially when we're thinking about Black and Latinx media, right, or Spanish language media, like there's also like internal specificities about like what language do we use, which journalists are actually on our side, and then trying to lift up the realities of our stories instead of just trying to sensationalize us as either a fad or, some sort of new part of the chaos of the 21st century or whatever. There's a lot of journalism that's just real overwrought, let's say, right? And so that the answer I would say also to that is to just like desensationalize a lot of this stuff by also just making sure that content experts are always in the room and always contributing to the actual stories. The people that y'all interview should be the ones shaping the stories, you know, if you're going to interview somebody. Also, this is another one of my major pet peeves, is that journalists have come to me to ask me for quotations and stuff, and they only want to hear about one part of a gender non-conforming, one part of a trans experience, right? So I'm a communist, I'm a Muslim. All of those things are really important actually to who I am as a trans person, period. And so to say that like, oh, well, we only really want to hear like, for example, there's been this fad, I'm so sorry, our doorbell's ringing. It's New York, right? So there's been this whole thing where people have been real excited about like, oh, trans Muslims exist, you know? They're not necessarily excited to hear about like from Black trans Muslims about being a Black Muslim and having that be a trans experience. They're not necessarily excited to hear me talk about drone strikes or Muslim bans as manifestations of transphobia that impact my life as a Muslim trans person, right? People don't care about that. So I'll say all that stuff, right? And then the quotation that'll be used in the piece is, being a trans Muslim is hard, says Malcolm Shanks, right? And so it's just a draining. It's a draining of the realness of our lives, and also the fact that like many of us are activists. Like we dedicate our lives to dedicating to like building some knowledge, to building connections, to building our own messaging and how we present ourselves. And so journalists come and presume that they are the experts in crafting and telling stories. The issue is that, you know, especially if they're cis journalists, it means coming with a certain amount of humility to someone else's story, always coming with humility. So I would say that's like the number one thing that I would think of, but not draining like the context out of our lives because our complexity is inconvenient.
Thank you. Ishalaa, what about you? What do you think?
I think we need to start for the basics, which is why when a person has died and is a trans woman, journalism are always publishing their name at birth. Like that basic situation that it is so disrespectful needs to change ASAP. Like
dead naming.
Like just the naming, like by disrespecting a person who is not here anymore to defend themselves by publishing their name, who they fought their whole life to change it. It is the worst thing that any journalist can do. For me, that's like the basic. And of course, it is extremely important for me that any journalism choose who they're gonna allow to talk about trans people in general. Because, for example, like every single newspaper and news in general is covering and allow J.K. Rowling to throw shade to trans people, for example. Why are we doing that? Because this woman is rich. It's a TERF, but it's a rich woman and white. So white, every single media existing in the face of earth is allowing a woman like this who has this much influence in society to throw shade against trans people and validating our lives. And I can give you tons of names of people who has been allowed in journalism and in media in general to talk about trans people in general with no clue of our existence and our experiences and all of the intersections that we have to deal with. So I think that it's important. Of course, opening positions for trans people to work there and to bring the knowledge of being trans person, it is important. But I think that people get like some sense of respect and work ethics when covering a body that is not here anymore, it will be amazing. Thanks.
Raquel, do you have anything you want to add?
Candidly, I've just been so engrossed with everything that everyone has said. I don't even remember what the original question was. I'm like here, like, yes, just like nodding along. Could you ask one more time?
Yeah, of course. So you mentioned specifically actually earlier the idea that this is like an epidemic, and this is something that we are seeing is a real pattern. And so we're curious as journalists, what are ways to convey that? Like Malcolm is saying, like putting trans journalists at the center, letting them tell their stories, giving them microphones and pens and paper. So are there things that you think journalists can do similarly to that can convey this to audiences and not portray it as a one-time incident?
Yeah, well, I think for clarity, just, what I got, I think also from Malcolm as well, is not just trans journalists, but also the journalists who are covering these things, make sure that you're going to trans people at the source. Because how many times, do we read an article about anything trans related, and the quote is from some random cis person? I don't care if you work at or are the lead of the largest international LGBTQ plus anything. If you are a cis person being looked at as an expert on the trans experience, that's a problem, right? Or at the very least, what you're asking them needs to be in line specifically with what their actual expertise is, because I bet you it is not the trans experience. So that is one thing that irks the hell out of me. And it doesn't lead to a richer story, period. I think the other thing too is that when you don't go to the actual community that you're telling a story about, and there are a lot of problems here, right? Maybe you don't need to be the one covering the story if you can't even tell that this is a story that at the heart is about the trans community, first of all. And that's fine. We don't all have the range, honey. Like, you ain't gonna see me like necessarily up in Silicon Valley talking about the ins and outs of, like, I don't know, the next Tesla rocket. I don't even know what I'm talking about right now, right? And that's fine. I think thinking that any writer can cover issues about social justice is a problem, because it's not like that at all. And I have been the person who has had beats where I had to cover city council meetings and random things that are very universal that hopefully anybody can have some entry point into. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case every time when you're covering issues so close to marginalization and a particular type of it. I think other things that feel important too, I mean, getting into the nitty gritty, but when I think about the facts of a trans person's life, it does take a certain amount of range to understand the particular circumstances that we are often in. When I'm covering the murder of one of my trans siblings, I have to be very clear. I'm always going to be respectful of people who are sharing their time and sharing their words about someone. But I also know that it is a fact that oftentimes there is a disconnect between how family, like biological family, relates to, interacts with, talks about their loved one, and chosen family, right? Friends and community members talk about family. Talk about their loved one. I also know it might be important to, whether it's in the story or not, to know what how close that biological family was to that person, because they might have been estranged from that family because they were transphobic and not affirming of who they were, right? So why would it make sense to then trust who they called their supposed loved one over people who were most recently in this person's life? So I think that those particular things are very important. And if you don't know those things, maybe it's not your beat, you know? So I think those things are very important when we look at what is happening to trans people. And then I think we also have these issues where we silo, exactly what you were saying, Malcolm. We silo people away from their other experiences and identities. You know, when I think about going back to our earlier example of the Walking While Trans ban coverage, it has been so disconnected from the larger sex worker rights movement. It has been, you know, how often has it been mentioned in the same breath as the Decrim NY work, where there is, you know, some overlap between the trans organizers organizing around sex work and many of the other folks who are part of Decrim NY. Or if we think about the conversations we were having after the murder of George Floyd, why are we not talking about the Walking While Trans ban when we talk about this larger fight against the criminal justice system that Black and brown folks are constantly facing, you know? So where we can say offhand, this is like the trans stop and frisk, but you ignore that it's actually layered on top of stop and frisk affecting a Black or brown trans person. So it's actually that we're facing double legislation. It's not that one is its own particular type that's only applied in this instance versus the other one.
Right. Thank you guys for that. Something we also want to talk about, we know that marginalized communities in general often have a very fraught relationship with the media, and rightfully so, and don't always trust the media when they are approaching them for stories or when they're wanting to cover these kinds of conversations we're having. And so what do you all think, and any of you feel free to answer this, what do you think journalists should be doing to work to build trust with the trans community in order to tell these stories? And again, we've had lots of conversations about really thinking about whether or not you're the right person to tell that story in the first place. So for you guys, what do you think is something journalists need to be doing to build trust with communities that maybe don't necessarily want to share those stories with them or have a little bit of a barrier between them, and rightfully so?
Well, I think that one of the things that might be a good idea to start is to not just look for the sad story of the trans people, maybe looking for people who also is an inspiration, people who has a successful in life that are trans and that needs to be told. Because there is also a lot of successful people who is trans, whose stories can inspire people in general, and especially those who are trans, of course. So I think starting by there, not just looking for the morbid part of our community, as in like what we do, if we do have surgeries, if we did the legal change name, or like if we were to prison, if we were in a male facility, all of the things that is being repeated over and over and over again. Maybe go and say like, oh, this person is a trans and just open a restaurant, or this person just graduated and is a lawyer right now and we want to share their life. Those type of narratives matter and needs to be told. I think starting there, it will be a good thing to build trust.
Yeah, so telling the fuller picture of people's lives and not so focusing on the tragedy and some of the more negative stories that we see constantly be perpetuated. Thank you for that. We also want to let the attendees know as well, don't forget to send your questions in the Q&A. We're getting closer to that portion. So if you all have any questions, make sure you send them in there. Raquel, what do you think as a journalist, especially, what do you think are things journalists can do to build that relationship and to better some of that trust? I think Ishalaa definitely gave us a great example as well.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the idea that we just supplant or, you know, exchange stories that may be tragic with ones that are only about success, right? Because I actually feel that we need it all, first of all. I think it's really more of expanding, right? So it's not that we silence more people, it's that we actually speak to and elevate more people. Conversation. And I don't know that folks often get that, because one thing for me actually is when I look at media trends, and this is not just in print and other types of journalism, but also in Hollywood and in TV, I actually see that we often have so much of the tragedy, of course. I think that's the biggest bucket. And we do have some of the what's considered success, but we don't even expand that out, right? I mean, success looks like a very limited thing in this trans visibility era. It's very much like, oh, this model campaign, oh, homegirl got, $1 million deal, like, these very exceptional stories, right? And so it's like we either have tragic stories or we have exceptional stories. And I'm actually more interested in how do we just have stories that is just like, I'm trans and I'm basic as hell, like, or no, I shouldn't say it like that, right? Because then my examples will seem like that's what I'm saying, but that's not what I mean. I'm really saying like how we gloss over certain stories as basic. Success can be so many different things. I want to see the trans teachers, because they are out there, right? There are probably some trans principals out there, honey. Maybe they're keeping it on the low because what kind of society we living in, but they might be out there. The trans doctors, right? I had seen no stories. And this is not to say they're not out there, I just haven't seen them, of trans folks who are nurses working within the heart of the pandemic, right? There's so many stories that we have not uncovered because we're so fixated on what's considered tragic and sensational, right? What can be sensationalized, and that can be either really glitzy or really messy and dirty. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is us also just figuring out the structural barriers of why we don't have enough trans people actually hired, right? Or mentored or supported to be a part of media and the media work, right? We're still in a space, I think, a lot of times where trans folks overwhelmingly can only be in front of somebody's lens. They can't be behind it, right? I think we're just crossing that barrier where we see like the Tourmalines as a Black trans filmmaker, or Texas Isaiah, a Black trans photographer who is now shooting magazine covers. Honey, that changed in like, it seemed like it changed almost overnight, and homeboy was getting, some great covers. But also the writers, right? Like, we need more fostering of Black trans folks to be storytellers, and not just about our experiences being trans, but our experiences being all of these other brilliant multitudinal things that we also embody as well. And I want to see more of that.
Malcolm, what do you think?
I know this is kind of specific, but I beg the media to please, please, please cover trans people as workers. That is so important and is constantly falling out. And it just like, it feeds that exact, it naturalizes that exclusion, right? So just as Ishalaa was talking about, right? Then when the media coverage comes up, nobody's asking why are folks being funneled and pushed into doing sex work? Why are options being limited for people? How are they being limited on a daily basis? Through the policies, through the behaviors of the boss. And I can tell you the reason they don't, because in order to do that, journalists would actually have to cover the lack of worker power that exists in the United States, period, which they don't want to do. And so part of the reality of that is what they would rather do, all the time is just look at the HRC like corporate equality index and be like, so-and-so does so good with trans people, da, 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 and that's what they would rather cover, instead of, for example, going to labor organizers, right, to union organizers, to the women who are organizing themselves inside of workplaces, the people who are organizing themselves inside of workplaces. Like, one example that I can think of that was really fascinating, and this article came out years ago, so I'm sad that I keep naming like written articles, but Meredith Talusan is a brilliant journalist and did this amazing long form story about trans women in call centers in the Philippines. And that was such a nuanced piece of journalism. It was so excellent, right? And that's the kind of example of what could be out there actually telling the true lives of folks in ways that actually end up building power for the people whose stories are being told, right? Who actually end up having a positive impact on the organizing that's able to be done, you know, instead of it just being like, oh, here's more attention and more aggression, which is what the media usually gets for lots of trans and gender nonconforming people. It's like sensational attention. And then there's a reaction of like people just getting mad when they see trans people walking down the street, and it actually contributes to violence towards trans people. And so I think the media actually needs to be just a lot clearer about what their goals are, like Raquel was saying, about what the goals are in terms of just like the stories. Is it just to cast a bright light into a dark corner? Because we don't need that shit.
Thank you,
Exactly.
Malka. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because I think media should normalize us, that we can perform in any environment and in any type of work, not just in a specific sex working or hairdressing or entertaining in the bars and things like that. I think like call centers, supermarkets, all of those basic works that anybody can perform, we also can do it. And if media can push that into the mainstream by saying like, we can do as anybody, it's gonna normalize us as human beings.
Yeah, thank you so much for being so real with all your thoughtful responses. That was our last question before we move into the Q&A portion of the evening. So again, like Noel said, for the sake of time, if you have any questions now, anyone, you can add them to the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as possible. And Arno is gonna start us off.
Thank you again to the panelists. These were such good discussions and so much wisdom. So the first question is from Katie. We have a question about police reports and dead naming, or in the case of a police report. So we have a case in which, so there's multiple things happening in Katie's question. First part is when a police, sorry. Are there ways to avoid using dead names for trans people who are killed by state violence in the first moments where, in a breaking news moment, the first name we have is like their dead name? What are the ways journalists can avoid dead naming in a case of like a breaking news event where the police is releasing a name that might be the dead name? And then the second situation is, once that is done and the mistake is done, what can be done to correct it? How do we correct something like that? Should it be something at the bottom? Should it be another article? Things like that. So I don't know who wants to go first, but like that would be an interesting question and situation to think about.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a tricky situation trying to get those facts early on. I think I've benefited, and a lot of LGBTQ plus folks who are journalists and writers benefit obviously from having a network, right? Going back to that piece about building a rapport with community and trust. A lot of times we do have that network, and people know somebody through somebody and can kind of verify. And, you know, I have to give it up also to the late Monica Roberts too, who was often like the first, I mean, if you want to think about the first responder of like trans folks when it comes to a lot of the murders of trans people of color. Like, she was the one you could call and be like, girl, do you know? And she knew. But I think the problem isn't necessarily, when we get into a situation with dead naming, this might be messy, but I think it's hard to say that we're necessarily dead naming if you've done your due diligence and this is the only name that you have, right? When I think about willful dead naming, I guess there's a distinction. That to me comes when someone does have multiple sources and they're only going with one without kind of doing the due diligence of figuring out what is the most accurate name, right? Because we know that everyone has their own kind of unique relationship with their name. So I do think that it's unfair for us to just say, without kind of knowing other sources and other people to credit, that a name is wrong if we haven't done that due diligence. So that's one thing, right? I think we also have to break down this kind of binary idea of thinking. We hear a certain name and we're like, oh, that's a boy name. Why are you calling this trans woman a boy? But it's like, plenty of trans women don't change their names. Plenty of trans people don't change their names, right? So I think it's also, we deal with a lot of binary thinking as well when we read or hear certain names. But I do think you should do your due diligence, talk to multiple people. I would say at least 3 people if you can who knew the person and knew them, whether they, I wouldn't say multiple biological family members. I would say maybe 1 or 2, but you got to balance that out with like chosen family, community, and friends. One time, the only source I had was someone who worked with a young trans woman, Tracy Single, at a community center, right? Like, that was the only contact that I had, but I went with her and talked to some other folks. So you got to get a little bit creative about the facts of a person's life. And that doesn't mean make things up, but that does mean diversify your sources there. Long answer, sorry.
Yeah, for me, I think that if I were the person who is covering a person who dies and is trans and their legal name has not been changed because of maybe not access to do it, because that it costs money. There is a lot of organizations, but not everybody knows about them. So the very fact that you are covering a person who is dead, you know why. Not all people who passed away in an accident is being covered by the media. So if the motive is because that is a trans person who dies tragically because of this or that, you can put Mrs. last name instead of using the whole name. And you can make an explanation at the beginning. We're using just the last name because we don't get the transgender woman name. And we out of respect, we're not gonna use the boy name. You can explain it, not explain it after you already disrespect this person on the article. So if I am covering someone that goes by Smith, I will say Mrs. Smith passed away tragically because of police brutality, whatever. And then make an arrangement if I don't have the name at that time and make the footnote on the article days later with the actual name, instead of publicly disclose this person's name the very first moment you create that article. That will be my approach. That will be my suggestion, because if the reason why you're covering this dead body is because it's a trans person, start respecting their identity. And Mrs. could be also a different thing, because there is a lot of trans women and trans men that go by they, them. So that is another situation, but it will be less. I said that like wrongly doing the pronouns of somebody is not as impactful as in disclosing their legal name when they are like actually identified as a different thing. So yeah, that will be my approach.
Malcolm, did you have additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, one, when I heard what Raquel was describing, I was like, oh, you mean journalism? Right? Like, and I think this is where a Black trans perspective is so important here, because like, why are the police anybody's main source when it comes to state violence? Nobody should be trusting the cops to provide the information, the first information that anybody gets. So if your only source is the cops, that means you don't have a trustworthy news source. You don't have a news source that is trustworthy enough for you to actually publish this article. And I get really heated about this because I get so pissed seeing constantly articles about police violence that only quote cops, that only quote police unions, that only quote communications workers for the state. Like, why is it that we just like take a press release and then just like publish that on the New York Times and act as if that's fact-based journalism? It is not. What it allows to happen is actually it allows the state to set the agenda, the terms, the story, the narrative, the power relationships, the everything, right? So, I mean, I would say if there's a situation like where you're in the first few hours, then maybe you should just wait until you got some better sources.
Right. I know I'm like jumping back in, but Malcolm, yes. And that was like in my head. And I skipped right over thinking about the police as a credible source because I don't. You know, and you know, when I think about this topic, that sounds weird to a lot of people, but especially after this last 4 years of knowing how much the state can be in cahoots with disinformation and misinformation, it shouldn't be that far-fetched that you would be getting probably incorrect information from a police officer or from any agent of the state. Just saying.
Yeah, thank you all. We have a question from Simi, specifically for Malcolm. What do you think we can do to push newsrooms to look into writing stories about trans people who are civilian survivors of war? And Simi is speaking from experience as a trans person with war trauma, navigating the media's focus on trans veterans.
So I think this is actually really connects to that exact last issue of thinking of the state as a credible news source. That's actually exactly, I think, what it is like people quote the police, the FBI, the CIA, and the State Department as credible sources when we know that these people are not credible. These are lying war criminals, and we should regard them as such, and we should name them as such, and we should name them as such in the context of trans violence against trans people too. I think it is an old school colonial tactic, there's that word again, of the United States to only humanize people by including them in the national army. It happened to Black people, happened to Puerto Ricans, it's happened to, right? So there are so many examples. I think one of the other examples that we can think of is that the actual model for like the Indian residential schools came from a POW camp in the Seminole Wars. So this guy, Pratt, whose name is on a university here, actually took the model of basically they would take African Seminoles and they would march them around the camps and give them uniforms. And they thought that was making them proper, real men. That was giving them the right kind of masculinity, right? And so then that translates into just like, oh, inclusion in the military means civilization. Inclusion in the military means success for your people. It means that you are now contributing to what makes America great, which is never made explicit, is warfare, right? And so we should name that warfare is one of the main ways that the United States does violence to trans people around the world. That is not a radical trans anti-war position. It should no longer be a marginal position because there are trans people literally at every single border, the maritime borders, the northern borders, the southern borders, who are experiencing US foreign policy firsthand. The death squads in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala that are funded by the United States government, those guns don't just stay in the hands of those militia members. They go into the hands of gang members who then use them to murder trans people in broad daylight, right? And so those are the kinds of connections that we actually need to name. The occupation that is supported by the US in places like Palestine and places like Kashmir, those do violence to trans people. They heighten the violence in society. I think we need to stop concentrating on veterans as like the way or the single mode, because it contributes to a story about are trans people included or not. And the actual questions that should be asked are much more complicated than that. They should be questions like, how is it possible that the United States could be advertising itself as an excellent or good place to be for trans and gender nonconforming, or as a better place to be, when in fact the United States is the reason that trans and gender nonconforming people have to flee their countries? That is a question that the media could be asking. Another question the media could be asking is, what is it like to be a trans Marine, for example? And what kind of community might one make with the trans communities that are in the places where you're occupying? You know, those are the kinds of, that's another question that might be asked of establishing more just humanizing links. Like, people in the United States are not the only humans in the world. And that's, I think, a thing that journalists consistently get wrong.
Can I also add, this is not anywhere as brilliant as anything you just said, Malcolm. Like, honey, I want to like kiss your cheek right now. That was everything. Thinking about the source. So that's, I mean, the source of these narratives that are seen as progress for the trans community is not often trans people. I mean, that's also the other part of it. Outside of the journalism sphere, you got to be really clear that there are all types of messaging being crafted by all types of people and all types of organizations. And a lot of times that messaging is not coming from trans people. So just because you see something trending on Twitter or a million stories come out that say, you know, trans people serving in the military is progress for all trans people, be very clear that some of this messaging is not necessarily coming from the community that it says it's coming from, and definitely not a diverse splattering of that community. Trying to keep it cute.
Thank you so much for this. This is resonating with a lot of things. So another question that we have from a non-binary audience member, Violin, is the question is there anything that the panelists would like to tell to trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary folks working in media? Because we've been talking a lot like to a cis audience, but what would we say to trans folks in the audience, especially those working in media? I don't know who wants to start with this one. I guess Raquel as a journalist, or Ishalaa, you would.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get some part of it.
The question is, what do you want to say to a trans, gender nonconforming, or non-binary person working in media right now?
I want to say congratulations for making your goals coming true, your dreams coming true. I really feel that we need to be in every single environment and every single type of work and every single type of things that happen in society. And I think that having you there will make justice for a lot of people in the future, and maybe will help to fix a little bit what has happened in the past. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree. I want to see us everywhere, all trans, everything. You know, I think it's also worth noting that this connects to all, in general, all types of like marginalized groups, but don't let folks pigeonhole you. If you know, I know this is such a like, you know, millennial Gen Z way of thinking that's like, bump it. I'm not, you know, sometimes you have to work places and cover beats that you don't want to, especially starting out. I had to do that. But realize that you do have a say in some way about what you want to cover, right? And don't let anyone pigeonhole you, especially if you're hired for these roles that are like, we want the LGBTQ reporter. You have a lot of power in that role, and you can decide, right, what is happening there. Understand that power, but also you don't have to be a trans or GNC generalist, right? If you are the homie that like knows the ins and outs of like tech and video games, like I want you to do that beat. And it matters and it's important. You know, if you want to be the political reporter, then do that beat and be that person, right? I hate that we often get pigeonholed and we're kind of forced to be this generalist. And sometimes we have these editors and folks who are like, this is mildly about the trans experience, write about this. Don't let them do that. And don't let anyone kind of stifle you, because you deserve to have a beat if you want one, just like anyone else that's as specific as you want it to be or not.
Great. And we have a question from Emma about how journalists can approach gendered coverage, like for instance, Women's History Month, in a way that's transgender inclusive. So anyone can start with that. Oh, and I also, sorry, just had a message also from Seeing Me too. Just wanted to give you, thank you, Malcolm, for your really thorough response earlier.
Raquel, I see you smiling. You have some thoughts about this?
You know, I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm smiling because I definitely had this assignment recently that was only supposed to be about women, and I totally gender blanked it up and made it very like gender expansive and non-binary, and I just submitted it that way. I didn't like have a whole conversation because I feel like I'm beyond that at this point. It was something that didn't need to be so gendered. But it's for a quote unquote women's magazine, which I also think is kind of BS. I don't understand that anymore. Gender coverage. It's hard because I think we have to fight to, force people to be as specific as possible. If we're talking about women, then let's do that. But don't just tack on non-binary folks, because in a lot of instances, you're being disingenuous and disrespectful, because, non-binary folks and other gender expansive folks are not women light, right? It's not like you are women plus. And I think that's a lot of times what cis people are often trying to go for, because they think that it's like woke or whatever, but they're actually like not doing what they're supposed to be. So push and ask these questions on assignments, like, what are you really talking about here? Are you actually talking about women? Are you talking about people with marginalized gender experiences? What are we actually trying to go for here? And I think pushing for that clarity is so important. And I think we're in a time now where maybe in general, we don't have to be so worried about if we're pushing the envelope too much. Like if you think something would be better expressed in a more gender expansive way, then I think at least push to have that conversation. Don't just kind of shy away from it, because I think I've had a lot of instances where I just shied away and didn't, push for something more gender expansive earlier in my career, at least. Late, I think as I've moved on, I've had a little bit more leverage.
I think it is important to know what are you writing about. It is extremely important, because if you are trying to put out there an information that is related to people, female, assigned at birth, health, you need to address everybody with that. And it could start by addressing genitalia and say like everybody with this body parts needs to check this for your health. But when you are just addressing gender, and if it's a women's day, it will be just trans women and women. It should be like they, them, because it will be offensive, because we are putting they, them into one box instead of gender non-binary. Is my thinking. But I just feel that it is a tricky moment in time to not to offend everyone when we are addressing something, or to miss inclusion of some people as well. So yeah, I think it's just the topics. What do you want to do? What are you covering? It's but as a whole, in order to check what gender should be addressed to or referred to. That's just my opinion.
I feel like a lot of gendered coverage is actually just pandering anyway, from what I've seen. Like, especially when it comes to Women's History Month, a lot of it is like the first woman to blah, blah, blah for the empire, the first woman to blah, blah, blah. I'm just like, all right, whatever. Is that actually gendered coverage? Maybe, I don't know. I think there's some really interesting gendered coverage that's coming out actually about the impacts of transphobia and specifically trans misogyny on cis women that I think has actually been really fascinating. Like, there's been some coverage about how like so much of the transphobia in the UK women's shelters in England has actually caused people to hang up on women with deep voices, regardless of their gender identity or regardless of their experience, right? And and it's caused a lot more scrutiny of hijabis and big bodied women and women of color, regardless of gender, in bathrooms as well, because of this transphobia and trans misogyny. So I think those are things that are happening all the time that really could be a way of like de-binarizing gendered coverage, because there's actually a lot of transphobia that harms like not just trans people, even though it's aimed at excluding trans people or harming trans people. I would also say like just being like a little bit careful, more careful sometimes in the reporting. There's actually just a lot of misunderstanding that people have about terminology. And so being clear, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there was like a lot of internet fury, that was just premised on such a ridiculous misunderstanding back when I think it was Kotex changed the packaging on menstrual pads and a lot of their menstrual products, right? To no longer have like the little female sign on it, because women are not the only, and females, whatever, are not the only people who menstruate. And then everybody was like, this is just getting ridiculous, like, because they thought that everybody was trying to include trans women, and it became this whole like ridiculous conversation that goes just backflips and mental pretzeling about genitalia and what they do and how we can talk about our bodies in an expansive way, when truly the original journals that were it was kind of pandering coverage to begin with, right? And people knew it was pandering coverage to say, oh, Kotex is so great because now they're more trans inclusive, but you can't actually say, oh, they're more trans inclusive. You have to identify the ideological reasons, the community that they're trying to help, and the actual impact that it's had. Otherwise, you're just sort of, again, releasing that same sort of sensationalized aggression or let's say hate mongering, actually, coverage that causes people to just think, oh, trans people are just ridiculous and we go too far all the time. So I think that's the approach to gender coverage that I'm really hoping to see a lot more of.
Thank you. We have another question, and this one is for Ishalaa. Sorry, I just need to find it again. So Oscar is asking that I'd like to know your thoughts on how English language news outlets have covered the Spanish-speaking trans community. Do you feel like they're doing a good job at translating their testimonies and hear their stories?
That is a really good question, because unfortunately, the people who is bilingual is the one that is being covered the most. People who is monolingual that only speak Spanish, journalism do not want to have like look for an interpreter or things like that, and it is not being covered. There is a lot of stories, there is a lot of struggles, there is a lot of success in the community that speaks Spanish only. And unfortunately, like for panels like this, I've been asked a lot to participate when there is a lot of other people who also can give their thoughts, but in not interpretation or translation, or think that I should be the one because I can communicate and the other people's stories are left behind because I don't know them all. Like I do not represent them all. Like I am so happy and so I have worked a lot for what I have achieved, which is like learning the language, going to school, having a different type of job, etc. And it is not the story of all of the people that is next or it is behind or is aside of me. So in order for them to participate, I think journalism should look for translators and not asking the person to look for a translator. Like I have some people who is journalists that ask me for, has asked me for other people to talk to. And I am like, well, I have these friends that speak Spanish only. And they are asking me, oh, do you think they have somebody to translate them? And I am like, well, it's supposed to be your job, not mine or they to be like heard and their voices being like portrayed on your articles. So yeah, it is important for journalists to do a better job looking for translators and address not just the trans female, but also trans male and also other gender expressions, because they exist and they are important and they count. And I don't represent them all.
This calls for another panel, all in Spanish, and the school could do that because we have all in Spanish.
Yep.
Wink, wink.
Yeah, definitely. So we're out of time. We do want to be mindful of our panelists and everyone's time. Do you have time? Do you have a minute extra just for the last question, or are we? Is that okay for everyone? Okay, great. So we have a couple questions from Terrence, but one is, how do we humanize and normalize trans experiences in Black communities specifically? There's often this narrative that low-income Black people and Black people in general don't get it.
Good question. I think we have to be clear that if we think a little bit deeper about it, it's not just a Black thing, you know. I think a lot of times when people are exposed to trans experiences, like even for me, I really didn't know much about the trans experience until I went off to college, right? And I had access to, like, you know, quote unquote higher education and was able to take gender studies classes and all of those things. Like that's how I found out more about myself, right? So I do think that oftentimes there is some kind of barrier around access to information about trans people, and also going back to some of the statements earlier about how people mostly interact with trans people through media. We didn't even talk about like social media, right? So a lot of times it's ignorant people sharing disinformation about the trans experience to other people. And when I think about some of the Black owned outlets, right? I think about like the Shade Room, you know, there's a lot of people be up on the Shade Room, but like they put out a lot of destructive narratives, right? When I think about back in the day, what was a media takeout? I think about the Breakfast Club, right? These are urban outlets, right? And oftentimes we know that social media is where a lot of people get their news. And if you aren't someone who studied journalism or in this media work, curating a healthy media diet is going to be difficult, right? Not to mention that there are definitely people actively trying to disinform people. So that's also another thing. So I just want to strip that back, because I think that it is unfair. Like, we can talk about transphobia in the Black community, but it is unfair to kind of operate with this idea that transphobia is deeper or worse necessarily in the Black community than in any other community, much less the general public. And then the last little tangent I'll say about that is, like, when I think about the politicians who are overwhelmingly passing this anti-trans legislation, they Black, they not Black, they white, you know? So that's the thing that we have to like tackle as well, is that this transphobia is happening in every sector of society. So that's one thing. You know, I think we have to get specific about where we have conversations and how we have them. So for me, you know, when I think about an audience for a particular article or something, there have been plenty of articles that I wanted to write specifically about the Black trans experience that I didn't want to be consumed first and foremost by a general audience. So I think it is important to be very clear about the publication that you're pitching certain things to. When I want to, you know, go in on the Breakfast Club, I try not to write for a general publication. I've written for like The Root when I want to talk about the Breakfast Club, right? Or Cassius. I don't know if that's still around, not to be shady, but I haven't read them in a while, but that also was like a Black digital outlet, right? Because I wanted to critique what was happening specifically in the Black community. I wouldn't necessarily go to a general publication to have those kind of conversations. I think, you know, when I think about, like, if I want to critique I want to critique white feminism, and particularly send a message to white feminists, you know, I might not write it for Essence, right? Because that's mostly a Black audience and Black women overwhelmingly. I'm probably going to write that for, like, I don't know, a Marie Claire or something else that has a more general audience, and it's more likely to get in front of white eyes. So I think we have to be very clear about where we're having certain conversations so that we don't inadvertently feed into anti-Black narratives that Black people are inherently more homophobic or transphobic than other folks.
Thank you for that. So we're gonna wrap up. So thank you everyone for, unless Malcolm, you wanted to jump in. No, okay, cool. So thank you everyone. Thank you to the panelists for your great questions. We'll send Ishala's new song by email. And maybe the panelists will ask you, one of the questions was about like other pieces that you thought were really great in covering the trans communities in original. So maybe we'll ask you that and then circulate it by email. So thank you so much from the representatives of the NABJ chapter, NAHJ chapter, and Queer Club, to Raquel, Ishalaa, and Malcolm for a very thought-provoking evening. And thank you to Jenny Choi and Lindsay Allen for their help in making this panel happen. Thank you to everyone who came today, and have a good night.
Thank you, and good night, everyone. Nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you too. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Malcolm, Ishalaa. Thank you.